What if I told you that the most famous house in America has a history far stranger than anything they taught you in school? That beneath the polished tours and postcard photos lies a story of secret tunnels, hidden fires, forgotten scandals, and rooms that officially don't exist. You probably think you know the White House, the presidents, the press conferences, the Rose Garden photo ops. But tonight we're going somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere the tour guides don't take you. Here's the thing about old houses. The older they get, the more they've seen. And this house has seen almost 2.5 centuries of power, secrecy, heartbreak, and strange coincidence. Some of what you're about to hear is thoroughly documented fact. Some of it drifts into legend, the kind of story passed down through staff and historians until no one's quite sure where truth ends and myth begins. I'll let you know which is which as we go, because that's part of the fun of history. Not everything comes with a certificate, so before we begin, settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. This is the kind of video best experienced slowly, half awake, letting one strange fact drift into the next until you're not quite sure if you're still listening or already dreaming. If that sounds like your kind of evening, go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps this channel keep telling these quiet, strange stories, and it costs you nothing but a click before you drift off. Now get comfortable. We're about to walk through 50 forbidden facts about the White House, the kind of details that never made it into your history textbook, starting with something that happened long before the building even had its famous white paint. Let's begin in 1814, with a fire that very nearly ended the story of this house before it truly began. 1. Laying the cornerstone. Before there was a fire to survive, there was a foundation to lay. On October 13th, 1792, a small ceremony took place on a patch of cleared land in what would become Washington, D.C. Freemasons gathered. A brass plate was prepared. A cornerstone was set into the ground to mark the official beginning of what would become the White House. It should have been simple. Historians should be able to point to the exact spot today. They can't, despite searches using ground-penetrating radar, old newspaper accounts, and Masonic records. The precise location of that original cornerstone has never been confirmed. Some researchers believe it sits somewhere beneath the north portico. Others think it may have been covered during later renovations and effectively lost to time. There have been a few searches over the decades, including one in the 1950s during President Truman's major reconstruction of the building, when engineers gutted the interior down to the outer walls. Even with the house essentially hollowed out, the cornerstone stayed hidden. Whether it was deliberately concealed, accidentally buried, or simply misremembered in the chaos of early construction is something no one can say for certain. It's a strange thought, isn't it? The most photographed house in America began with a stone nobody can find. A tiny mystery, tucked into the literal foundation of the building, quietly unresolved for over 2 centuries. And that uncertainty, as we're about to see, was really just the beginning of how much of this house's story would depend on hands history preferred not to name. 2. Enslaved labor in construction. The White House was built largely by people who were never free to walk through its front doors. Records from the 1790s show that enslaved African Americans, rented from local plantation owners, worked alongside European immigrants and free laborers to quarry sandstone, cut timber, and lay the foundation of the presidential mansion. Enslaved workers were involved in nearly every stage of construction, from digging the footings to hauling stone from quarries in Virginia. The plantation owners who rented out these laborers were paid directly for their work. The workers themselves received nothing. Historians estimate that enslaved labor made up a significant portion of the workforce that physically built the building meant to symbolize American liberty. For generations, this fact barely appeared in official White House histories. It wasn't emphasized on tours. It wasn't part of the story most Americans learned growing up. That began to shift in the early 2000s as historians pushed for a fuller accounting of the labor behind the building's construction. In 2016, the White House Historical Association formally acknowledged the role enslaved workers played in building the house, an acknowledgement that had taken over 2 centuries to arrive. It's a quiet, uncomfortable thread running through the earliest years of the building's story, one that sits just beneath the marble and sandstone most visitors admire without a second thought. And speaking of the people whose names rarely make it into the official story, the man who actually designed the building had a far more unlikely path to the job than you might expect. 3. James Hoban, the architect, in 1792, President Washington wanted a design worthy of the new nation's leader, so his administration held a public competition, open to anyone with a design and a willingness to submit it. The prize was $500 and a city lot. Several architects entered. Thomas Jefferson himself is believed to have submitted a design anonymously, though it didn't win. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who had trained in Dublin before coming to America. Hoban modeled his design partly on Leinster House, a grand building in Dublin that today houses the Irish Parliament. It's a quiet irony that one of America's most iconic symbols of independence drew inspiration from a building tied closely to British aristocratic life in Ireland. Hoban didn't just design the White House, he stayed involved with it for decades, overseeing its original construction through the 1790s, and later returning to lead its reconstruction after the devastating fire of 1814 nearly destroyed everything he'd built. Few architects get to rebuild their own creation from the ashes, but Hoban did exactly that. He continued making additions and repairs to the building well into the 1820s, effectively shaping the White House across two entirely different eras of its life. Despite his central role, Hoban remains one of the lesser-known figures in American history, a foreign-born architect whose vision quietly became the blueprint for presidential power for over 2 centuries. And speaking of that fire Hoban was called back to fix, it's worth remembering just how close the White House came to never being rebuilt at all, a story we'll return to shortly. 4. The 1814 burning. James Hoban had barely finished admiring his own work when history handed him the ultimate repair job. In August 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops marched into Washington largely unopposed. The city had little to defend itself with, and the government had already fled. Soldiers entered the White House, reportedly sitting down to eat a meal left behind on the dining table before setting the building ablaze. Fire consumed the interior. Wooden beams, furniture, portraits, and personal belongings burned through the night. By morning, only the exterior stone walls remained standing, blackened and hollow, a shell of what had been the young nation's proudest symbol. First Lady Dolly Madison had famously fled hours earlier, reportedly insisting that a portrait of George Washington be saved before she left, a small act of preservation amid the chaos. The rest of the house wasn't so fortunate. Rain that fell shortly after the fire is sometimes credited with saving the structural walls from complete collapse, though how much credit the weather truly deserves is something historians still debate. What's certain is that the building many considered indestructible, a symbol of a nation still finding its footing, was reduced to ash and stone in a single night. President Madison and his administration had to govern from temporary quarters for years afterward, while reconstruction slowly took shape. It's a strange image to sit with, the people's house standing open to the sky, its future uncertain, while the country it represented kept moving forward without it. And it's that image, the scorched walls left behind by the fire, that leads directly into one of the most persistent stories associated with the building's recovery. 5. The whitewash myth. For generations, a simple explanation circulated about why the White House is white. The story goes that after the 1814 fire left the walls charred and blackened, workers slathered on white paint or whitewash to hide the scorch marks, and the name White House stuck as a result. It's a tidy story. It fits neatly into the narrative of destruction and rebirth we just walked through. There's only one problem. It isn't quite true. Records show the building's sandstone exterior was painted white as early as the 1790s, more than 2 decades before the British ever set foot inside. The white paint wasn't decorative flair or damage control. It served a practical purpose, protecting the porous sandstone from moisture and the freeze-thaw cycles of Washington winters, which could otherwise crack and crumble the stone over time. So the color existed long before the fire ever gave anyone something to hide. The nickname White House was also already floating around informally in the early 1800s, appearing in letters and newspaper references well before 1814. That means the popular story, tidy as it sounds, has the sequence backward. The building wasn't painted white because of the fire. It was already white, and the fire simply gave the myth a dramatic origin story that was easier to remember than the truth. Historians have tried for years to gently correct this misconception, with mixed success. The whitewash story remains one of those pieces of half history that gets repeated in classrooms and tour groups alike, not because it's accurate, but because it makes for a better narrative than routine masonry maintenance. It's worth remembering, though, that even the most persistent stories about this building don't always hold up once you look closely at the paperwork. And speaking of paperwork finally catching up to reality, the building's most famous name took surprisingly long to become official. 6. Official name change. Despite being called the White House informally for well over a century, the building's actual legal name for most of its early existence was far less memorable. Official documents, letters, and government records typically referred to it as the President's House or the Executive Mansion. The nickname White House existed in common speech, in newspapers, even in some presidential correspondence, but it carried no formal weight. That changed in 1901, under President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, never shy about reshaping tradition to fit his own preferences, decided the informal nickname deserved formal recognition. He had White House officially adopted as the building's name, complete with stationery and seals updated to reflect it. It was a small bureaucratic shift, but a meaningful one, closing the gap between what everyone already called the place and what its paperwork actually said. Roosevelt's changes weren't purely about naming either. That same year, he oversaw a significant renovation of the building's interior, separating the president's living quarters from the official offices, a practical shift that shaped how future administrations would use the space. The renaming almost seems like the least dramatic part of his changes, and yet it's the one that stuck most firmly in public memory. It's a curious footnote, really, that one of the most recognizable names in American government wasn't made official until the 20th century was already underway. For over 100 years, presidents lived and worked in a building the public called by one name, while the government insisted on another. Roosevelt simply let the informal win. It's a small reminder that even the most fixed, permanent-seeming symbols of American history often took quiet, unofficial paths before anyone bothered to put them on paper. And once the name was settled, the house itself was far from finished changing, as the decades ahead would prove in ways few people expected. 7. The secret Treasury Tunnel. Once the name was settled, and the renovations of the early 1900s had reshaped how the building functioned, another story took hold, one that involves hidden passageways rather than official paperwork. For decades, a persistent rumor has circulated that an underground tunnel once connected the White House to the Treasury building next door, allowing presidents to move between the two structures without ever stepping outside. The story has a certain logic to it. The Treasury building sits remarkably close to the White House's East Wing, close enough that a connecting passage seems almost inevitable given how governments tend to value both security and convenience. And there is some truth buried in the legend. Records confirm that an underground passage did exist at one point, built primarily for utility purposes, running pipes, cables, and maintenance access between the two buildings rather than serving as some secret presidential escape route. Over the years, though, the story took on a life of its own. Tour guides and historians alike have fielded questions about a grand tunnel, where presidents supposedly slipped away for private meetings or avoided public appearances entirely. The reality, as far as historians can piece together, is far less cinematic. Whatever passage existed served practical infrastructure needs, not covert movement, though the boundary between fact and embellishment has blurred over the decades to the point where even some White House staff have repeated the more dramatic version, without realizing its origins are murky at best. What makes the story persist, perhaps, is how well it fits our expectations of a building layered with more history than we can see on the surface. A house that has survived fire, renovation, and a name change hiding in plain sight for a century certainly seems like the kind of place that might have a secret tunnel or two tucked beneath its floors. Whether or not any president actually used it to sneak between buildings unnoticed remains one of those details historians gently shrug about, neither confirming nor fully dismissing it. It's the kind of story that thrives in the space between documented fact and comfortable legend, much like the whitewash myth we walked through earlier. And speaking of hidden features that reveal just how much of this building exists beyond what visitors typically see, the White House's sheer size tells its own quiet story. 8. 132 rooms inside. From the outside, the White House looks almost modest, a stately but restrained structure that hardly hints at the scale hidden within its walls. Step past the facade, though, and the building reveals itself as something far larger and more complex than most visitors ever expect. In total, the White House contains 132 rooms spread across 6 levels, a number that surprises even people who've toured it in person, since public tours only cover a small fraction of that total space. Those levels include 2 basements, ground floor spaces used largely for operations and storage, the state floor where public ceremonies and formal events take place, the second and third floors reserved for the private residents, and additional working spaces tucked throughout. 16 of those rooms serve as family living quarters, spaces that have quietly witnessed decades of private presidential life largely hidden from public view. The remaining rooms handle everything from formal state functions to the practical daily operations required to keep a working government building running smoothly around the clock. It's easy to forget, when picturing the White House as a symbol on television or in photographs, that it functions simultaneously as a family home, a government office complex, and a ceremonial space all layered on top of each other. Each renovation over the centuries, including the extensive changes made under Theodore Roosevelt that we touched on earlier, has reshaped how these rooms connect and function, carving out clearer boundaries between public life and private life within the same walls. The building has had to adapt repeatedly, expanding its functional footprint below ground and reorganizing its interior layout, while keeping its historic exterior largely unchanged. It's a strange kind of architectural balancing act, maintaining the appearance of a fixed, unchanging symbol while constantly reworking the space behind that famous white exterior to meet the needs of whoever happens to be living and working there. And speaking of details that reveal just how much practical infrastructure exists behind that historic facade, there's one number that tends to catch people off guard every time it comes up. 935 bathrooms. Given everything we've just walked through, the burned walls rebuilt, the whitewash myth debunked, the tunnel stories half confirmed, the sprawling 132 rooms spread across 6 hidden levels, it should come as no surprise that a building this large requires plumbing to match. The White House currently contains 35 bathrooms, a number that quietly reflects just how much this historic structure has had to modernize behind its unchanging stone exterior. It's a detail that rarely comes up in history classes, overshadowed by stories of fires and famous portraits and dramatic renovations, but it says something meaningful about how the building has evolved to support the people living and working inside it. Early versions of the president's house, back when James Hoban's original design was still standing, had nothing resembling modern plumbing at all. Indoor bathrooms as we understand them today didn't exist yet, and basic sanitation looked entirely different than what later generations would come to expect. As decades passed and indoor plumbing technology advanced across the country, the White House gradually adapted alongside it, adding facilities as needs grew and expectations shifted, most notably during the larger renovations of the early 20th century, when the building's interior was substantially reworked. By the time all the additions and updates were finished, the White House had grown into a building capable of comfortably supporting a large household, extensive staff, and constant streams of official visitors, all requiring the kind of basic infrastructure that early residents like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson could scarcely have imagined. It's a small, quiet reminder that even the most symbolic buildings still have to function as actual living, working spaces day to day, regardless of how much history and legend surrounds their walls. Behind the state dinners and formal ceremonies, behind the fires and reconstructions and secret tunnel rumors, there are still just very practical questions about how many people need to use the bathroom at any given moment, and the answer apparently requires 35 separate rooms to solve. It's easy to get swept up in stories of burning buildings and hidden passageways and forget that somewhere beneath all that history, the White House still had to keep up with basic modern comforts like everywhere else. And with all that plumbing quietly humming along beneath the surface, it's worth remembering that not every mystery about this building involves fire or secrecy at all. Some of them are simply about numbers nobody bothers to mention. 10. The hidden bowling alley. Numbers like 35 bathrooms and 132 rooms start to paint a picture of a building that quietly accommodates far more than most people imagine. But sometimes the surprises inside the White House have less to do with necessity and more to do with simple pleasure. Tucked away in the basement, in a space most visitors never even know exists, sits a single-lane bowling alley, a small and slightly unexpected feature for a building otherwise defined by state dinners and historic portraits. The story goes back to 1947. When a group of Truman staffers decided to give the president a birthday gift unlike anything the White House had seen before. Harry Truman, by most accounts, wasn't even a passionate bowler, but the gesture apparently meant enough to him that the lane stayed in place, tucked beneath the West Wing where few outside the resident staff would ever notice it. It's a strange kind of image to sit with, the leader of the free world, in the middle of the Cold War's opening chapters, occasionally rolling a ball down a modest wooden lane in the basement of his own home. The alley was later moved and expanded during subsequent administrations, eventually finding a permanent spot in the old executive office building, though the original basement version remains part of White House lore. Some presidents used it regularly. Nixon, in particular, was known to bowl there late at night, sometimes alone during periods of considerable stress. Others barely acknowledged it existed, treating it as just another oddity left behind by a predecessor. It's easy to imagine White House life as an unbroken chain of formal ceremonies and difficult decisions, but small details like a bowling alley in the basement remind us that actual people lived there too, people who occasionally needed something simple and ordinary to unwind after long days spent managing the affairs of the nation. It didn't matter that the lane was modest, or that it sat in a space with no windows and low ceilings. It offered something rare inside those historic walls, an activity with no ceremony attached to it at all. No advisors needed to be present, no press coverage required, just the simple rhythm of a ball rolling toward a small set of pins in a quiet corner of a house otherwise consumed by history in the making. And speaking of quiet corners built for relaxation rather than ceremony, the basement wasn't the only place where presidents found ways to step outside the pressures of the job, if only for an hour or two. 11. A private movie theater. If the bowling alley offered presidents a chance to unwind through simple physical activity, the White House's private movie theater offered something a little more relaxed still, a place to sit back and disappear into a story for a while. Since the 1940s, the White House has maintained its own 40-seat theater, a space specifically designed for private film screenings away from any public attention. The theater came into regular use under Franklin Roosevelt, whose administration recognized both the practical and personal value of having a secure private space to watch films, whether for entertainment, morale, or simply a brief escape from the immense pressures of wartime leadership. Over the decades, the theater became something of a quiet tradition passed down from one administration to the next. Presidents and their families gathered there for early screenings of major films, sometimes before they even reached public theaters, courtesy of connections with the Hollywood studios eager to maintain good relationships with whoever occupied the office. Eisenhower reportedly enjoyed westerns. Kennedy and his family used it often for casual family evenings, a rare pocket of ordinary life inside a home that rarely allowed for ordinary things. Nixon, in the middle of some of the most stressful years any president has faced, was known to retreat there for late-night screenings when sleep proved elusive. It's worth pausing on that image for a moment, a president burdened by decisions that would shape the future of the country, sitting alone in a dark, private theater, watching a film with no cameras and no advisors present, if only to feel like an ordinary person for 90 quiet minutes. The theater has hosted countless private screenings over the years, some historic, some entirely unremarkable, each one hidden from public record simply because there was no reason to document something so personal. It stands as a small, human detail buried inside a building otherwise defined by formality and public duty, a reminder that even the most powerful people in the world still need somewhere to sit quietly in the dark and watch a story unfold that has nothing to do with the one they're currently living. And speaking of spaces built for quiet retreat rather than public display, one particular edition from the Roosevelt era went on to have a rather unusual second life, hidden just beneath where journalists now stand every single day. 12. The pool under the press room. Franklin Roosevelt, who lived with the lasting effects of polio, relied on swimming as one of the few forms of physical therapy that offered him real relief. And in 1933, an indoor pool was constructed at the White House specifically to support that need. The pool allowed him to exercise privately, away from public scrutiny at a time when the extent of his condition was rarely discussed openly, and it quickly became an important part of his daily routine throughout his presidency. Long after Roosevelt's time in office ended, the pool remained in use by several subsequent presidents, offering a private space for exercise and relaxation, much like the theater and bowling alley did in their own ways. But by the early 1970s, under the Nixon administration, a decision was made to build a permanent press briefing room, a space where journalists could gather regularly, rather than relying on temporary arrangements scattered around the property. The location chosen for this new press facility happened to sit directly above the old Roosevelt-era pool. Rather than removing the pool entirely, the simplest and most practical option at the time was to construct the new press room directly over it, effectively sealing the old pool beneath a raised wooden floor. To this day, that original pool reportedly still exists beneath the James S. Brady Press briefing room, hidden below the floor where reporters stand, asking questions during official briefings, largely unaware of the quiet, empty pool resting just beneath their feet. It's a peculiar kind of layering, a space built for physical therapy and private reflection tucked silently underneath one of the most public and scrutinized rooms in the entire building, where every word spoken is recorded and broadcast to the world. Some stories mention the pool being drained and partially filled in over the years, while other accounts suggest most of its original structure remains largely intact beneath the modern flooring. Either way, it stands as a fitting symbol for the White House as a whole, a building where old purposes rarely disappear completely. They simply get built over, layer after layer, until the past is quietly folded beneath whatever comes next. And speaking of quiet, forgotten spaces hidden just beneath the surface of everyday White House life, not every hidden feature involves basements and floorboards. Some of the more curious details are woven right into the walls themselves. 13. Lincoln's reported ghost. Some corners of the White House aren't remembered for hidden pools or bowling alleys, but for something far less tangible, a presence that refuses, according to certain stories, to fully leave. For more than 100 years, staff members, guests, and even a few heads of state have described an unmistakable feeling while walking certain hallways late at night, the sense that Abraham Lincoln, or something of him, still lingers within those walls. The stories tend to center around the Lincoln bedroom and the corridor just outside it, spaces tied closely to the man who occupied the White House during one of its darkest and most consequential periods. Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly kept a desk in that room specifically because she felt Lincoln's presence while working late into the night, though she was always careful to say she never actually saw him, only felt something she couldn't quite explain. Winston Churchill, staying at the White House during the Second World War, is said to have encountered something standing near the fireplace after stepping out of a bath, an experience he never fully elaborated on, though he reportedly refused to sleep in that particular room again. Theodore Roosevelt claimed to sense Lincoln's presence decades earlier, describing a distinct feeling of being watched while passing through the same halls. Even Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands is said to have once fainted after hearing a knock at her door and finding no one there, only to later learn the room she was staying in had long carried whispers of Lincoln's lingering presence. None of this, of course, can be proven in any meaningful sense. There are no photographs, no verified recordings, nothing beyond personal testimony passed down through generations of staff and visiting dignitaries, but it says something about the weight Lincoln's memory still carries that so many respected, level-headed people across so many decades have described strikingly similar experiences in the very same rooms. Perhaps it's simply the psychological effect of sleeping in a house so steeped in tragedy and history, where the sheer scale of what happened there settles into the mind and translates into something that feels almost physical. Or perhaps, as some prefer to believe, certain places absorb the weight of what occurred within them and never fully let it go. Either way, the stories persist, told quietly among staff, mentioned occasionally by guests who insist they felt something they can't quite put into words. It's one of the few White House legends that has never really faded, passed along not through official records, but through generations of people who lived and worked inside those walls and came away with a feeling they never could quite shake. And speaking of spaces inside the White House, shaped less by tragedy and more by quiet, everyday comfort, one particular room began its life doing something far less glamorous than hosting presidential relaxation. 14. The solarium's origins. Perched on the third floor of the White House, bathed in natural light through walls of windows, the solarium has long been considered one of the most peaceful rooms in the entire building, a space where several first families found a kind of quiet retreat unlike anywhere else in the residence. But its story didn't begin with comfort in mind at all. The space that eventually became the solarium started out as something far more practical, a rooftop laundry area, tucked above the main living quarters, used simply for hanging and drying clothes long before anyone imagined turning it into a place for relaxation. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the space began to shift in purpose, gradually transformed through a series of renovations into a sunlit room that took full advantage of its elevated position and abundant natural light. By the time Franklin Roosevelt's family lived in the White House, the solarium had become something of an informal gathering space, valued precisely because it felt separate from the formality found almost everywhere else in the building. Its most enthusiastic adopters, however, were the children and grandchildren of various presidents, who saw it less as a historic room and more as a private playroom high above the rest of the house. Eisenhower's family used it often, and it became particularly associated with the Kennedy children, who reportedly treated it as something close to a nursery, filled with toys and the sounds of everyday family life, echoing through a space once used for nothing more than drying laundry decades earlier. Later, it earned a more solemn nickname among some administrations, sometimes referred to informally as the room where difficult private conversations took place, given its seclusion from the rest of the house. But for most families, its identity remained simple and warm, a bright, quiet space that felt worlds away from the formal rooms below, offering an escape into ordinary domestic life within a building otherwise built for ceremony and public duty. It stands today as one of the clearest examples of how spaces inside the White House rarely retain a single fixed purpose. A rooftop laundry area became a sunroom, then a playroom, then a private retreat passed down through generations of families who each shaped it according to their own needs. And speaking of spaces shaped by very different needs entirely, not every hidden corner of the White House exists for comfort or quiet reflection. Some were built with something far more serious in mind. 15. The PUC bunker. Beneath the east wing of the White House, far below the level most staff or visitors ever access, sits a heavily fortified structure known as the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, often referred to simply as the PEOC. Unlike the solarium or the old rooftop laundry space above, this particular area was never designed with comfort in mind. It exists for one purpose only: to keep the president and select staff safe and operational during moments of extreme national crisis. The bunker's origins trace back to the Roosevelt administration, built during the tense early years of the Second World War, when the threat of attack on American soil felt more immediate than it ever had before. Over the following decades, it was reinforced, expanded, and updated repeatedly to reflect the shifting nature of global threats, from nuclear concerns during the Cold War to more modern considerations involving terrorism and other emergencies. The PEOC gained widespread public awareness on September 11, 2001, when Vice President Dick Cheney and other senior officials were moved there as the attacks unfolded, coordinating the government's response from deep beneath the East Wing, while the situation above remained uncertain. That moment offered the public one of its rare glimpses into a space normally kept entirely out of view, a reminder that beneath the historic architecture and carefully maintained gardens, the White House was also built to function as a place of last resort during the nation's worst possible days. Details about the bunker remain deliberately limited. Officials rarely discuss its exact specifications, its full capabilities, or precisely how it has been used across different administrations, and that secrecy is by design rather than oversight. What is known suggests a self-contained space capable of sustaining essential government operations, even if the rest of the building above became inaccessible or unsafe. It stands as a quiet, hidden counterpart to everything else the White House represents, a place built not for ceremony, comfort, or history, but purely for survival and continuity of government during moments when every other system might fail. It's a strange thought to sit with, that beneath the sunlit rooms, the quiet hallways, and even the old rooftop laundry-turned-family retreat, there exists a space built entirely around the possibility of catastrophe, waiting in reinforced silence for a day that, so far, has only truly tested it once. 16. The chief usher's quiet power. Not every position of influence inside the White House comes with a title the public recognizes, and few roles illustrate that better than the chief usher, a position that has quietly managed the daily rhythm of the entire household since the 1800s. Despite the modest name, the chief usher is essentially the general manager of the White House, overseeing everything from staff schedules to state dinners, from maintenance emergencies to the precise timing of a president's morning routine. It's a role that exists almost entirely behind the scenes, rarely mentioned in history books, yet without it the building simply couldn't function the way it does. The chief usher answers directly to the first family, coordinating an enormous staff that includes housekeepers, chefs, groundskeepers, electricians, and calligraphers, all while maintaining a level of discretion that borders on invisibility. Many chief ushers have served across multiple administrations, quietly carrying institutional knowledge from one presidency into the next, remembering details long after the politicians themselves have moved on. They know which pipes tend to act up in winter, which floorboards creak, which rooms hold family memories too tender to mention. Some have held the position for decades, watching children grow up in the halls they managed, watching families arrive in mourning or celebration, and adjusting the entire household around each new emotional season. It's said that a good chief usher can sense a first family's needs before those needs are even voiced, adjusting menus, schedules, and staffing with quiet precision. Because the position touches nearly every operational detail of the White House, some historians argue the chief usher holds more day-to-day influence over the physical running of the building than almost anyone else who ever sets foot inside it, more than cabinet members, more than senior advisors, certainly more than most guests could ever imagine. Yet the role remains largely unknown outside a small circle of historians and former staff, a quiet thread running steadily beneath more than 2 centuries of very public history. And speaking of quiet steadiness, eventually giving way to public debate, one addition to the building's exterior in the mid-20th century turned out to be far less invisible than the chief usher's daily work, sparking conversation across the entire country almost overnight. 17. The Truman Balcony Debate. In 1948, President Harry Truman decided the White House needed a small addition to its south portico, a second-floor balcony that would give the family a quiet, shaded space to sit outside without leaving the residence. To Truman, it seemed like a simple, practical improvement, a place to enjoy fresh air away from the formality of the rest of the building. To much of the public and a fair number of architects and historians, it was something closer to architectural heresy. The White House's exterior had remained largely unchanged in its classical proportions for well over a century, and the sudden appearance of a balcony altered the visual balance of the south face in a way that some critics found deeply unsettling. Newspapers ran opinion pieces debating whether Truman had the right to modify such an iconic structure at all. Architectural purists argued the addition disrupted the clean lines originally envisioned by the building's early designers, while others accused Truman of putting personal comfort ahead of historical preservation. Truman, never one to back down from criticism, defended the balcony as a reasonable and modest change, pointing out that the White House had always evolved gradually to meet the needs of whichever family lived there at the time. The debate raged in editorial pages for months, an unusually passionate public argument over a rather small architectural feature. Eventually, as it often does, the controversy faded, and the balcony that once caused so much public hand-wringing quietly became known as the Truman Balcony, accepted as a natural part of the building's appearance. Today, few visitors even realize it wasn't part of the original design, a small reminder that even modest changes to something as symbolically important as the White House can spark surprisingly fierce public debate. And as it turned out, Truman's small balcony controversy was only a preview of a far more serious structural conversation that would consume his presidency almost entirely. 18. The structure nearly collapsed. By the time Truman's balcony debate had settled into quiet acceptance, a much larger and more urgent problem was unfolding just beneath the surface of daily White House life, one that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with basic safety. In 1948, engineers discovered that the interior structure of the White House had deteriorated to an alarming degree. Floors sagged. Walls showed dangerous signs of instability. A leg of Margaret Truman's piano reportedly broke through the floor of her sitting room, a small but startling incident that prompted a much closer inspection of the building's overall condition. What that inspection revealed was far more serious than anyone expected. Decades of renovations, additions, and structural modifications, layered on top of the original early 19th century framework, had left the interior dangerously weakened. Engineers determined that the building was, in essence, being held together more by habit and paint than by any dependable structural integrity. The situation had become severe enough that the Truman family was forced to move out entirely, relocating across the street to Blair House while the White House underwent a massive and painstaking renovation. Workers gutted the interior almost completely, leaving only the outer stone walls standing while an entirely new steel framework was constructed within. It was slow, meticulous work, stretching over several years, quietly transforming the White House from a fragile historic shell into a structurally sound modern building wrapped in familiar, unchanged exterior walls. Truman insisted that the historic character of the rooms be preserved wherever possible, even as nearly everything behind the walls was replaced. When the family finally returned, the White House looked much the same as it always had from the outside, yet was in truth an almost entirely new structure supporting that same historic facade. It remains one of the least publicly recognized transformations in the building's long history, a moment when the White House came remarkably close to structural failure, quietly rebuilt from the inside out, while the world outside barely noticed. 19. A steel skeleton inside. While the previous section touched on just how close the White House came to collapsing under its own history, the actual engineering solution deserves its own quiet moment of attention, because what happened during that Truman renovation was nothing short of architectural surgery on a national scale. Once the family had relocated to Blair House, and the full extent of the damage was understood, engineers made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable in its scope. Rather than attempt to patch or reinforce the failing interior, they decided to remove nearly everything inside the outer walls and rebuild the entire structure around a new steel skeleton. Picture the White House as an empty stone shell, its familiar sandstone exterior standing alone while inside, a modern steel framework rose floor by floor to support a house that had never been designed to bear that kind of internal weight. Workers carefully numbered and cataloged architectural details before removing them. Mantels, moldings, door frames, even sections of plaster ornamentation, so that as much of the historic character as possible could be reinstalled once the new frame was in place. It was a strange kind of preservation, tearing a building down to its bones in order to keep its face exactly the same. The steel structure that emerged was in essence an entirely new building constructed inside the borrowed skin of the old one. This new frame gave the White House something it had never truly had before, a stable, modern skeleton capable of supporting generations of future renovations without the same risk of quiet, invisible decay. Truman took a personal interest in the process, occasionally touring the construction site himself, watching as beams rose where load-bearing walls used to stand. He insisted that certain historic rooms be reconstructed with careful attention to their original appearance, even though almost nothing behind the walls resembled what had been there before. The renovation took years longer than expected and cost far more than initial estimates, prompting quiet grumbling in Congress about the expense of essentially rebuilding a national landmark from the inside out. But the alternative, allowing the White House to continue deteriorating structurally, was simply not something anyone was willing to risk. When the Trumans finally moved back in, the rooms looked remarkably similar to how they always had. The same proportions, the same historic detailing, the same sense of continuity that visitors expected. Yet hidden within those walls was a completely modern steel structure, quietly doing work that stone and timber alone never could have managed for another century. It remains one of the most significant transformations in the building's history, even though most people walking through its halls today have no idea that the structure supporting them dates back only to the mid-20th century rather than the early 19th. And speaking of hidden structural challenges that quietly shaped the White House long before steel beams ever entered the picture, there was another practical problem tucked away in the building's earliest design, one that had far less to do with survival and far more to do with simply getting dinner on the table. 20. Early kitchen troubles. Long before anyone worried about steel frames or sagging floors, the White House had a much more immediate and far less glamorous problem, a kitchen that seemed almost designed to make life difficult for anyone trying to cook in it. The original kitchen, tucked into the basement level of the residence, suffered from poor ventilation, awkward spacing, and a layout that made even simple meal preparation an exercise in frustration. Smoke from the wood and coal-fired stoves often lingered in the space far longer than it should have, filling the low-ceilinged rooms with heat and haze that made working conditions genuinely unpleasant. Presidential cooks in the earliest decades of the White House frequently complained about the arrangement, noting that the kitchen felt more like an afterthought than a carefully considered workspace. The distance between the kitchen and the upper-floor dining rooms created its own set of headaches, requiring food to travel long distances through narrow halls and staircases before ever reaching the table, often losing its warmth along the way. Servants and cooks developed elaborate systems of timing and coordination just to ensure that dishes arrived in a reasonable state, a challenge that seems almost quaint compared to modern kitchens, but was a genuine source of daily stress at the time. Some early staff members reportedly grumbled that the kitchen's design seemed to have been chosen with architectural symmetry in mind, rather than any real understanding of how food preparation actually worked. Storage space was limited, ventilation was inconsistent, and the heat generated by the ovens had nowhere good to go, creating uncomfortable working conditions, especially during Washington's notoriously humid summers. Over the years, small adjustments were made, additional ventilation here, expanded storage there, but the fundamental awkwardness of the original layout lingered for decades. It wasn't until much later renovations, including the sweeping changes brought about by the Truman-era reconstruction, that the kitchen finally received the kind of thoughtful redesign that modern staff had been quietly wishing for since the building's earliest days. Even today, historians studying the White House's domestic operations point to those early kitchen complaints as a small but telling example of how even the most powerful residence in the country wasn't immune to the same everyday frustrations found in any poorly designed home kitchen. And speaking of early efforts to make the White House more livable despite its architectural quirks, one of its very first residents took it upon himself to reshape another part of the house entirely, driven less by frustration and more by personal taste. 21. Jefferson's wine cellar. Thomas Jefferson, never one to leave a space unimproved if he had an idea for how to make it better, took a particular interest in reshaping parts of the White House during his time there, and one of his more memorable contributions involved something close to his heart: wine. Jefferson had spent considerable time in France before becoming president, developing a deep appreciation for European wines that went well beyond casual enjoyment. When he moved into the White House, he decided the building needed proper accommodations for storing and serving the wines he so carefully selected and imported. Under his direction, a wine cellar was added, designed to keep his collection at consistent temperatures and protect it from the fluctuations that could easily ruin a good vintage. This wasn't simply a matter of convenience. Jefferson approached the project with the same meticulous attention he gave to nearly everything else in his life, considering airflow, humidity, and storage arrangement with genuine care. Alongside the wine cellar, Jefferson also oversaw changes to some of the home's corridors, widening certain passageways to improve the flow of movement through the building, both for guests attending official functions and for the household staff working behind the scenes. These architectural adjustments reflected Jefferson's broader philosophy about the presidency itself, a belief that the private residence should feel more open and functional rather than rigidly formal in every direction. The wider corridors also made it easier for servants to move discreetly between rooms, delivering meals, attending to guests, and managing the countless small tasks required to keep the household running smoothly. Jefferson's approach to the building blended personal taste with practical necessity, treating the White House less as an untouchable monument and more as a living space that could be reasonably adjusted to fit the needs of whoever happened to be living there at the time. His wine cellar addition, small as it might have seemed in the broader scope of the building's history, represented an early example of the ongoing tradition of presidents leaving personal touches behind, subtle reshapings of space that quietly accumulated over time into the layered, complicated structure the White House would eventually become. Long after Jefferson left office, remnants of his early modifications continued to influence how later staff and architects thought about the building's flow, spacing, and function. It's a small, quiet reminder that even the most iconic residence in the country has always been shaped, room by room and choice by choice, by the personal habits and preferences of the people who called it home. 22. Indoor plumbing arrives. For all of Jefferson's careful attention to wine storage and hallway design, there was one comfort the White House went without, for decades after it was first built, something so basic that modern visitors often assume it must have been there from the very beginning. Indoor plumbing did not arrive until Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1830s, nearly 3 decades after John Adams first moved into the house. Before that, residents and staff relied on the same methods used in most homes of the era: water hauled by hand, chamber pots emptied by servants, and outdoor facilities that required a walk regardless of the weather outside. It's easy to forget, looking at the polished image of the White House today, that its earliest inhabitants lived with the same daily inconveniences as ordinary households across the country. Jackson, known for his blunt practicality in many areas of his life, apparently saw little reason for the president's house to lag behind when it came to something as fundamental as running water. Under his administration, pipes were installed to bring water into parts of the building, a modest but genuinely transformative upgrade for the household staff who had spent years managing the labor-intensive alternative. It wasn't a dramatic overhaul by modern standards, no elaborate bathrooms, no widespread plumbing throughout every room, but it represented a meaningful shift in how the house functioned day to day. Water no longer needed to be carried bucket by bucket from outside sources, and the basic tasks of cooking, cleaning, and washing became just slightly less burdensome for everyone involved. It's worth pausing on how strange this timeline feels in hindsight. For 30 years, some of the most powerful people in the country lived without the very plumbing that we now consider an unquestioned basic necessity in any home, grand or humble. Presidents debated policy, hosted foreign dignitaries, and shaped the future of a young nation, all while relying on the same rudimentary water arrangements as a modest farmhouse down the road. The upgrade under Jackson didn't happen all at once either. Plumbing improvements continued gradually over the following decades, expanding room by room as technology advanced and as later administrations found reasons to invest in further modernization. Each small addition built upon the last, slowly transforming the White House from a stately but practically old-fashioned residence into something closer to the functional, livable home we might recognize today. It's a quiet reminder that even the most iconic buildings evolve unevenly, shaped less by grand architectural vision and more by the simple, accumulating needs of the people living inside them. And speaking of small upgrades that quietly reshaped daily life within those walls, there was another invention, decades later, that would change how the White House connected not just to its own rooms, but to the entire outside world. 23. The first White House phone. By the time Rutherford B. Hayes took office in the 1870s, the White House had already absorbed decades of gradual improvements, plumbing, gas lighting, small architectural adjustments here and there. But nothing quite compared to the arrival of a device that would eventually reshape how the presidency itself operated. In 1877, Hayes had the first telephone installed in the White House, just 1 year after Alexander Graham Bell had patented the invention. It was a remarkably early adoption for a piece of technology still considered experimental by much of the public. The telephone was connected to the Treasury Department, one of the few other locations in Washington equipped with the necessary line at the time, meaning its usefulness was at least initially rather limited. There simply weren't many people to call. In a detail that feels almost quaint by today's standards, the White House phone number was simply the number 1, a fitting designation for what was, quite literally, one of the very first telephones in the city. Hayes reportedly found the device fascinating, even if practical uses for it remained scarce in those early years. Communication around Washington still largely depended on messengers, letters, and in-person visits, so the telephone functioned more as a novel curiosity than an essential tool of governance. Still, its presence in the White House signaled something important, a willingness even in the earliest days of a new technology to bring innovation directly into the heart of the nation's leadership. It would take years, and several more presidencies, before telephone use expanded enough to become a genuinely practical part of daily White House operations. Later administrations added more lines, more extensions, and eventually entire systems of internal and external communication that Hayes could scarcely have imagined standing beside that single, quiet device connected to the Treasury Department. What began as a strange, almost impractical novelty gradually became indispensable, until it was hard to picture a functioning White House without a telephone anywhere in sight. It's a small illustration of how new technology so often enters institutions long before anyone fully understands its eventual importance, arriving quietly, almost experimentally, and only later revealing just how deeply it will reshape everyday life. And speaking of quiet, early beginnings that later grew into something much larger, the very act of living inside the White House at all started off in a similarly unfinished, uncertain way. 24. John Adams moves in unfinished. Long before indoor plumbing or telephone lines, there was the simple matter of moving in at all, and the very first president to do so faced conditions that might surprise anyone picturing the White House as it looks today. John Adams became the first president to live in the building in November of 1800, arriving while construction was still very much incomplete. Walls remained unplastered in places. Staircases were unfinished, and the surrounding grounds looked more like an active construction site than the manicured lawns visitors expect now. Adams moved in anyway, largely because there was little alternative. The government itself was relocating to the newly established capital, and the president's house, as it was known then, needed to be occupied regardless of how far along the builders actually were. Abigail Adams, who joined her husband shortly afterward, left behind detailed and sometimes exasperated accounts of the conditions they encountered. She described drafty rooms, a lack of adequate firewood, and hallways that felt more like open construction zones than a finished residence. Some rooms couldn't be used at all, either because they lacked proper flooring or because construction materials were still stacked inside them, waiting for workers who hadn't yet finished their tasks. It was, by any reasonable standard, an uncomfortable and rather chaotic way to begin life in a brand new home, let alone one meant to represent the dignity of a young nation. Yet Adams and his family made do, adapting to the unfinished spaces much the way any family might when moving into a house still very much under construction. There's something quietly grounding about picturing the first presidential family shivering through drafty rooms and navigating half-built hallways, especially when compared to the polished grandeur the White House would eventually come to symbolize. It reminds us that even the most iconic institutions often begin in far messier, more uncertain conditions than their later reputation suggests. Adams himself only lived in the house for a few months before losing his re-election bid to Thomas Jefferson, meaning he experienced only the very earliest, roughest version of a building that would be refined, renovated, and reshaped again and again over the following centuries. It's a fitting beginning in its own way, a house built for permanence, starting out as anything but finished, occupied by a president willing to accept the inconvenience simply because the young nation needed somewhere, however incomplete, to call its seat of government. 25. Abigail Adams's laundry room. Speaking of Abigail Adams navigating those unfinished, drafty rooms, there's a small domestic detail from her time in the president's house that has become one of the more charming, if slightly debated, stories passed down through history. According to letters and later accounts, Abigail reportedly found herself in need of somewhere to hang laundry to dry, and with so much of the house still under construction, she apparently settled on the East Room, the same grand space that would eventually become one of the most formal and recognizable rooms in the entire building. At the time, though, the East Room was nothing like the polished, chandelier-lit space we picture today. It was unfinished, unplastered in places, essentially a large empty shell waiting for construction to catch up with its intended purpose. For Abigail, practicality won out over grandeur. With winter approaching and limited options for drying clothes indoors, the spacious, unused room became, at least according to popular telling, a convenient spot to string up laundry lines. It's the kind of story that feels almost too fitting to be entirely certain. The future ceremonial heart of the White House repurposed, however briefly, for the most ordinary of household chores. Historians note that while the tale is consistent with the conditions Abigail described in her letters, cold, unfinished, and lacking basic comforts, the specific detail of laundry hanging in the East Room comes down to us more as an enduring anecdote than an ironclad historical record. Still, it's easy to see why the story has stuck around for so long. There's something quietly delightful about imagining the elegant East Room, later host to state dinners, press conferences, and even presidential funerals, once serving as a makeshift drying room for a first lady, simply trying to keep her family's clothes clean during a difficult winter. It captures the gap between the White House's eventual symbolic weight and its very humble practical beginnings. Abigail Adams herself never seemed particularly concerned with symbolism during those early months. Her letters focus far more on cold rooms, insufficient firewood, and the general discomfort of living in a house still very much under construction. Whether or not the laundry specifically hung in the East Room, the broader picture she paints is one of resourcefulness, a family adapting to conditions that had little to do with prestige and everything to do with simply getting through the days. It's a fitting reminder that the earliest residents of the president's house weren't living inside a monument. They were living inside a construction site, making do with whatever space happened to be available, whether that meant an unfinished hallway or, as legend has it, a grand room later reserved for history's most formal occasions. And speaking of spaces that started out serving very different purposes than the ones we associate with them today, there's another area of the White House grounds that has quietly shifted in purpose and appearance again and again throughout the centuries: the gardens surrounding the house itself. 26. A long garden tradition. The idea of a White House vegetable garden might call to mind relatively recent history, a modern first lady digging into the south lawn with a shovel and a group of schoolchildren. But the tradition of growing food on the White House grounds actually stretches back much further than most people realize, all the way to the earliest decades of the building's existence. Thomas Jefferson, ever attentive to matters of both design and practicality, reportedly took an interest in cultivating vegetables and herbs on the grounds during his presidency in the early 1800s. Given his well-documented enthusiasm for agriculture at Monticello, it's not surprising that some of that same interest extended to the property he occupied in Washington. Later administrations continued this practice in various forms, sometimes out of genuine interest in self-sufficiency, other times simply because it made practical sense to grow at least some of the food consumed by the household staff and residents. The specifics of these early gardens are somewhat difficult to pin down. Records from the period are inconsistent, and the gardens themselves came and went, depending on the priorities of whichever family occupied the house at the time. Some administrations maintained modest kitchen gardens. Others let the practice fall away entirely, focusing instead on ornamental landscaping, or simply allowing the grounds to serve a more ceremonial function. This ebb and flow continued for well over a century, vegetable gardens appearing, disappearing, and reappearing depending on personal interest, wartime necessity, or shifting ideas about what the White House grounds were supposed to represent. During periods of national hardship, gardens took on a more practical role, echoing the broader victory garden movements that encouraged Americans to grow their own food during difficult times. In more prosperous, stable periods, the grounds often reverted to purely decorative purposes, with any food-related plantings quietly disappearing from view. It wasn't until much more recent history that the tradition experienced a well-known and highly publicized revival, when a modern First Lady chose to plant a large vegetable garden on the South Lawn, drawing renewed attention to a practice that had, in many ways, simply been waiting for someone to bring it back into the spotlight. What's often lost in that more recent story, though, is just how long the underlying tradition had already existed, quietly woven into the history of the grounds long before it became a widely covered public initiative. The soil beneath the South Lawn had, in some form, already absorbed nearly 2 centuries of intermittent cultivation, herbs and vegetables planted, harvested, forgotten, and eventually revived again by later generations, who had no idea they were echoing choices made by residents decades or even centuries earlier. It's a quiet thread running through the history of the White House grounds, proof that even something as ordinary as growing vegetables can become tangled up in the layered, ever-shifting story of the property itself. And speaking of layered, ever-shifting spaces on those same grounds, there's one particular garden whose design has changed so many times over the decades that it almost functions as a visual timeline of shifting presidential tastes. 27. The ever-changing Rose Garden. Just beyond the Oval Office sits a small, carefully maintained space known as the Rose Garden, a place so frequently featured in news broadcasts and official photographs that it's easy to assume it has always looked exactly the way it does today. In reality, the Rose Garden has been reshaped and redesigned numerous times throughout its history, each version reflecting the particular tastes, priorities, and even political considerations of the administration overseeing the changes. The garden's origins date back to the early 20th century, though its layout in those early years looked quite different from the neat, symmetrical space most people picture now. Over the following decades, various first ladies and administrations made their own adjustments, adding new plantings, altering pathways, and shifting the overall design based on both practical needs and personal preference. One of the more significant redesigns came in the early 1960s, when the garden was reimagined to better serve as a functional outdoor space for official events, ceremonies, and press gatherings, rather than existing purely as an ornamental garden tucked beside the West Wing. This shift transformed the Rose Garden from a quiet decorative feature into one of the White House's most recognizable and frequently used spaces, a backdrop for treaty signings, statements to the press, and countless photographs that have become part of the historical record. Later administrations continued to make their own subtle modifications, adjusting plantings, walkways, and seating arrangements to suit both aesthetic preferences and practical requirements for hosting events. Even seemingly small design choices, the types of flowers planted, the shape of the pathways, the placement of trees have occasionally sparked public conversation, with observers reading symbolic meaning into changes that were sometimes simply practical updates. A more recent renovation drew particular attention, As updates to the garden's layout and plantings became the subject of considerable public debate, with some praising the modernization and others expressing nostalgia for the previous design. It's a pattern that seems to repeat itself every few decades, changes made with genuine intention, followed by public reaction, followed eventually by quiet acceptance as the new version simply becomes the version most people remember. In many ways, the Rose Garden's constant evolution mirrors the larger story of the White House itself, a space that looks timeless from the outside but has in reality been continuously reshaped by the people who temporarily call it home. What appears today as a fixed iconic backdrop is really just the latest chapter in a garden that has been quietly rewritten again and again, each version reflecting its own particular moment in history before eventually giving way to the next. 28. The Oval Office is newer than you think. Most people picture the Oval Office as though it's always existed exactly as it looks today, a fixed and permanent fixture practically stitched into the building's original blueprint. In reality, the room didn't come into existence until 1909, more than a full century after the White House itself was first occupied. Before that point, presidents worked out of a variety of different spaces scattered throughout the building, some more suited to quiet paperwork than others, and none of them shaped quite like the room we now associate so strongly with presidential authority. It was President William Howard Taft who oversaw the construction of the Oval Office as part of a broader expansion of the West Wing during his time in office. Taft reportedly wanted a dedicated executive workspace that felt separate from the more personal, cluttered feel of earlier presidential offices, something formal, symbolic, and distinctly designed for the business of running the country. The oval shape itself wasn't chosen at random. It echoed the curved reception rooms found elsewhere in the White House, tying the new office visually back to the classical architectural traditions already present throughout the building. Interestingly, the very first Oval Office wasn't even located where the one we know today actually sits. It occupied a different position within the West Wing before later renovations, particularly during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, shifted it to its current spot closer to the Rose Garden. That relocation, along with structural updates over the following decades, helped solidify the Oval Office as the calm, symbolic center point most people recognize instantly, even if few could say exactly when it came into being. It's a small but telling detail, a reminder that even the most iconic, seemingly timeless corners of the White House were once new, temporary, experimental ideas shaped by the practical needs and personal preferences of whichever president happened to be in office at the time. The Oval Office we picture in our minds today, quiet, oval, framed by tall windows overlooking the garden, is really just one version among several, the version that eventually stuck. And speaking of ideas that eventually stuck after some early experimentation, the story of the West Wing itself, the very structure that would one day contain the Oval Office, has its own quiet, practical origin story worth pausing on. 29. Birth of the West Wing. For much of the White House's early history, there was no clear separation between the president's professional workspace and the family's private living quarters. Presidents conducted official business from rooms tucked inside the same walls, where their families ate meals, raised children, and simply tried to live something resembling a normal life. As the responsibilities of the presidency grew heavier and staff numbers increased, this arrangement became less and less practical. Papers piled up in hallways, meetings spilled into rooms meant for rest. The line between public duty and private life grew thinner with each passing administration. It was Theodore Roosevelt who finally decided enough was enough. In 1902, Roosevelt authorized the construction of a new structure attached to the main building, a space specifically designed to house offices, staff, and the day-to-day machinery of government, separate from the family's living quarters entirely. This new addition became known as the West Wing, and its creation marked a quiet but significant shift in how the White House functioned as both a home and a workplace. Roosevelt, who had a large family and a famously energetic household, reportedly welcomed the change simply as a matter of practicality. With 6 children living in the residence, the constant flow of political business through shared living spaces had become more than a little chaotic. Separating the two functions allowed the family quarters to feel, at least in theory, a little more like an actual home, while giving the growing executive staff a dedicated space to work without disrupting the household. The original West Wing was relatively modest compared to what exists today, a simple, single-story structure built primarily for function rather than grandeur. Over the following decades, it would be expanded, renovated and reshaped by numerous administrations, eventually growing into the layered security-conscious complex recognized today, complete with the Oval Office added a few years later under Taft. But its origin remains fairly humble, a practical solution to an increasingly impractical living situation, rather than some grand architectural statement. It's easy to forget that something as significant as the West Wing began as little more than an attempt to keep official business from spilling into the family dining room. And speaking of practical solutions eventually growing into something far more significant, the East Wing has its own quiet transformation story, one shaped not by domestic convenience, but by the pressures of a world at war. 30. The East Wing's wartime origins. While the West Wing came into being largely out of domestic necessity, the East Wing's most significant expansion emerged from a very different set of circumstances entirely. In 1942, with the country deep in the uncertainty of the Second World War, officials undertook a major expansion of the East Wing, adding new office space to accommodate the growing wartime staff needed to support the executive branch during such a turbulent period. On the surface, this expansion appeared to be a fairly straightforward architectural project, additional square footage added to handle additional administrative work. But beneath that practical justification sat a second, quieter purpose. The 1942 construction also served to help conceal the creation of an underground bunker, a reinforced shelter designed to protect the president and key staff in the event of an attack on the Capitol. Given the anxieties of the era, with the country freshly drawn into a global conflict following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the need for a secure, hardened space beneath the White House grounds felt like a reasonable precaution rather than an unusual one. The bunker, sometimes referred to informally in later years as the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, was built to withstand significant damage, offering a secure retreat during moments of national crisis. Its existence wasn't something officials wanted publicized at the time, and folding its construction into the broader East Wing expansion allowed the project to proceed with far less public attention than a standalone bunker announcement might have attracted. For decades, the bunker remained a quiet, rarely discussed feature of the White House complex, occasionally surfacing in public conversation during moments of national emergency, but largely existing outside everyday awareness. The East Wing itself, meanwhile, continued to evolve in the years that followed, eventually becoming home to various offices, including space traditionally associated with the First Lady and her staff. What began as a wartime necessity, part expansion, part quiet fortification, gradually settled into a more ordinary administrative role, its origins tucked away much like the bunker hidden beneath it. It's a fitting reflection of the White House as a whole, a building where practical expansions and quiet precautions eventually blend into the everyday scenery, until only the earliest planning documents remain to remind us why certain walls were built the way they were in the first place. And speaking of quiet precautions tucked away until only the record remained to explain them, sometimes the White House grounds themselves became the stage for something far less deliberate, a moment of genuine alarm rather than careful planning. 31. The 1994 small plane incident. Late at night on September 11, 1994, long before that date carried the weight it would come to hold 7 years later, a small Cessna 150 aircraft entered restricted airspace over Washington, D.C., and made its way toward the White House grounds. The pilot, a man named Frank Eugene Corder, had taken off from a nearby airport without authorization, flying low and largely undetected until it was almost too late for anyone on the ground to respond. Around 1:49 in the morning, the plane clipped a tree on the south lawn before crashing directly into the exterior wall of the White House, coming to rest near the base of the building, not far from where the First Family typically slept. President Bill Clinton and his family were staying across the street at Blair House at the time, as renovations were underway inside the residence, a detail that likely spared them from being anywhere near the crash site that night. Corder, the pilot, did not survive the impact. Investigators later determined that he had a history of personal struggles and had expressed troubling statements in the time leading up to the flight, though his exact motivations were never fully settled in the public record. What the incident exposed, beyond the tragedy of the individual involved, was a startling gap in the security apparatus meant to protect the most closely guarded home in the country. A small, slow-moving aircraft had managed to breach restricted airspace, avoid interception, and physically strike the building itself before anyone could meaningfully respond. In the aftermath, security reviews were launched almost immediately, examining how radar systems, air defense protocols, and response times around the White House needed to change. The incident contributed to a broader rethinking of aerial security around Washington, one that would only intensify further after the more devastating events of September 11, 2001, a full 7 years later, almost to the day. It's a strange, quiet footnote in White House history. A night when the building's usual sense of impenetrable calm was interrupted by something as simple and unexpected as a small plane slipping through the dark. And speaking of the layers of protection built around the president after moments like these, the people tasked with maintaining that safety net have their own quiet traditions, ones that rarely make headlines but shape the daily rhythm of White House life all the same. 32. Secret Service code names. Every president, along with members of their immediate family, is assigned a code name by the Secret Service, a tradition that dates back to the early days of radio communication when agents needed quick, clear, and secure ways to refer to their protectees over channels that weren't always private. The practice began as a purely practical solution. Radio transmissions could be intercepted, and using real names openly risked giving away sensitive information about a president's location or movements. A short, distinctive code name solved that problem simply and elegantly. Traditionally, the Secret Service selects these names, though families have often had informal input over the years. And there's usually an attempt to choose something that reflects the personality or interests of the person being protected. All the names within one family typically begin with the same letter, making it easier for agents to identify group communications at a glance. Franklin Roosevelt was reportedly given the codename Victory during the tense years of the Second World War, a fitting choice given the stakes of the moment. Ronald Reagan was known as Rawhide, a nod to his background in Western films and his home life on a working ranch. Bill Clinton carried the name Eagle, while Hillary Clinton was known as Evergreen. Barack Obama's codename was Renegade, and his family followed suit with names like Renaissance and Radiance. These names aren't meant to be secret in the dramatic, cinematic sense so often portrayed in films. They're simply a practical shorthand, though they've taken on a kind of cultural charm over the decades, offering a small human glimpse into how each family was perceived, or perhaps how they wished to be perceived during their time in the spotlight. It's a quiet tradition, functional at its core, but carrying just enough personality to make it memorable. And speaking of traditions that have quietly continued for well over a century, few White House customs are as gentle, colorful, or consistently repeated as the annual gathering that takes place each spring on the South Lawn. 33. The Easter egg roll tradition. The White House Easter egg roll is one of the oldest and most enduring public traditions associated with the residence, though its origins actually trace back to a location entirely separate from the White House grounds. For years, children in Washington had gathered on the lawns of the Capitol building each Easter Monday to roll eggs down the sloping grass, a simple, informal pastime that had grown increasingly popular by the mid-1800s. By 1876, however, the tradition had caused enough wear and damage to the Capitol lawn that Congress passed a law prohibiting its use for the event entirely. Rather than letting the tradition disappear, President Rutherford B. Hayes offered an alternative in 1878, opening the south lawn of the White House to the public for an official Easter egg roll, a decision that quietly established a new home for the custom that continues to this day. The event was simple in its earliest years, just children rolling eggs across the grass, but it grew steadily in scale and ceremony with each passing decade. Various presidents added their own touches over time, some introducing entertainment, others expanding the guest list, and eventually the event grew into a full day of activities including games, storytelling, and appearances by the first family themselves. The tradition has occasionally been paused, during both World Wars and more recently during public health concerns, but it has always returned once circumstances allowed, a small colorful thread of continuity running through more than a century of changing administrations. Thousands of children and families now attend each year, waiting for tickets that are distributed through a lottery system given the overwhelming demand. It's a tradition built on something refreshingly uncomplicated: wooden spoons, dyed eggs, and a gentle slope of grass that has hosted the same simple game since long before television, long before radio, long before most of the modern conveniences we now take for granted. In a building so often defined by its history of secrecy, tension, and quiet consequence, the Easter egg roll remains something different entirely. A small, ongoing reminder that not every White House tradition needs to carry weight. Sometimes, it seems, an egg rolling across the grass is simply that: And speaking of traditions that brighten the darker corners of White House history, few customs are as universally beloved as the one that lights up the National Mall each winter, drawing crowds who gather in the cold to watch a single tree glow against the night sky. 34. Lighting the National Tree. The tradition of the National Christmas Tree lighting began in 1923, when President Calvin Coolidge, a man not typically remembered for grand gestures or public displays of warmth, stepped out onto the ellipse, the great lawn just south of the White House, to light a 48-foot balsam fir shipped in from his home state of Vermont. It was a modest affair by today's standards, a single string of electric bulbs, a small crowd, and a brief ceremony marking what would become one of the most enduring public rituals in American civic life. The idea had been championed by a local trade association and a group of civic-minded citizens who thought Washington deserved its own version of the community tree lightings already popping up in cities across the country. Coolidge agreed, and with the flip of a switch, a tradition was born that would outlast him, outlast his successors, and continue essentially unbroken for a full century. Over the decades, the ceremony grew steadily more elaborate. Franklin Roosevelt used the tree lighting as a moment of quiet reassurance during the Great Depression, and later during the anxious years of the Second World War, when the lights were dimmed or the tree left unlit entirely during certain wartime years as a precaution against enemy aircraft. Harry Truman revived the full lighting after the war ended, and by the 1950s the event had become a televised affair, complete with musical performances, presidential remarks, and a growing sense of ceremony that reflected the country's evolving relationship with the holiday season itself. Today, the National Christmas Tree stands as a living tree, replanted periodically when the old one succumbs to age, disease, or the occasional stretch of harsh weather, and the lighting ceremony draws thousands of visitors to the ellipse each year, along with millions more watching from home. It's a strange thing to consider, that a single utilitarian gesture from a notoriously reserved president somehow blossomed into one of the most photographed and beloved traditions associated with the entire institution of the presidency. And speaking of things quietly growing on White House grounds without much fanfare, the ellipse and its towering fir tree aren't the only living additions to have found a home there over the years, tucked away in a spot far less visible than the south lawn. 35. Beehives on the roof. Since 2009, the White House has kept its own beehives, tucked discreetly onto the roof of the building, a detail that surprises most people who assume the grounds are reserved strictly for ceremonial gardens and manicured lawns. The hives were introduced during the Obama administration as part of a broader push towards sustainable, locally sourced food production on the property, an effort that also included the now well-known White House kitchen garden planted by Michelle Obama that same year. The beehives, maintained originally by a White House carpenter with a background in beekeeping, produce remarkable quantities of honey, sometimes yielding well over 100 pounds in a single season. That honey found its way into the White House kitchens, used in recipes for state dinners, holiday treats, and even a specialty beer brewed on the premises, itself a fairly novel addition to the residence's list of homegrown curiosities. Jars of the honey were also given as official gifts to visiting dignitaries and guests, a small sweet token representing a modest slice of self-sufficiency amid the otherwise highly managed and externally supplied operations of the executive residence. The bees themselves became something of a quiet mascot for the sustainability initiatives of that era, a living reminder that even the most heavily secured and monitored property in the country could still make room for something as delicate and low-key as a rooftop apiary. The tradition has continued in various forms since, with hives maintained as part of the broader garden program, producing honey that occasionally makes appearances at official functions to this day. It's an oddly charming detail buried within the layers of protocol and history that define the White House, proof that even amid state dinners and closed-door meetings, a colony of bees has been quietly going about its business just a few floors above. And speaking of quiet sustainability efforts that came and went depending on who occupied the Oval Office, few examples illustrate that shifting philosophy quite as clearly as what happened on the White House roof several decades earlier, involving a very different kind of installation entirely. 36. Solar panels come and go. In June of 1979, President Jimmy Carter stood on the roof of the White House and unveiled a set of 32 solar panels designed to heat water for the building, a symbolic gesture meant to underscore his broader push toward energy independence following the oil crises that had rattled the country throughout the decade. Carter spoke that day about the importance of renewable energy, framing the panels as a small but meaningful step toward a future less dependent on foreign oil and volatile energy markets. It was a forward-looking moment, one that positioned the White House itself as a kind of living example of the policies Carter hoped the rest of the country might eventually embrace. That example, however, didn't last particularly long. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, the panels remained in place for a few more years, largely overlooked until routine roof repairs in 1986 provided a convenient opportunity to remove them entirely. Officials at the time cited the maintenance work as the primary reason, though the removal quietly aligned with the Reagan administration's broader shift away from the energy conservation messaging that had defined the previous presidency. The panels themselves didn't simply disappear. Several ended up at Unity College in Maine, where they continued generating hot water for the school's cafeteria for years afterward, a strange second life for a set of panels that had once symbolized presidential policy on the White House roof. It would take more than 2 decades before solar power made its return to the residence. In 2003, a modest photovoltaic system was installed to heat water for the White House pool and grounds maintenance facility, largely unnoticed by the public. Then in 2013, during the Obama administration, a more visible set of solar panels was installed on the main roof of the residence itself, echoing, whether intentionally or not, the same gesture Carter had made more than 30 years earlier. It's a quiet little cycle within White House history. Panels installed, removed, replanted elsewhere, and eventually returned, each administration quietly signaling its own priorities through nothing more dramatic than what was or wasn't sitting on the roof above the Oval Office. 37. Filling in FDR's pool. Long before solar panels or beehives ever found their way onto the White House grounds, another quiet infrastructure change was already reshaping the building in a way most visitors today would never guess. Back in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt had an indoor swimming pool built on the ground floor of the West Wing, a project funded not through federal appropriations, but through private donations raised by the New York Daily News, since Congress at the time wasn't eager to spend public money on what might have looked like a presidential luxury. For Roosevelt, though, the pool wasn't about luxury at all. As a polio survivor, swimming was one of the few forms of exercise that eased the pain in his legs and allowed him some relief from the physical toll of his condition, and he used the pool regularly throughout his presidency, often for both therapy and a rare moment of solitude away from the pressures of the Oval Office. Harry Truman continued using the pool after Roosevelt's death, and even added a system that allowed him to swim while dictating memos to aides standing at the edge, a strange but oddly practical image of a president multitasking between laps. The pool remained a functioning part of the White House for decades, quietly tucked beneath the West Wing, mostly unnoticed by the public. That changed in 1970, when President Nixon's administration made the decision to cover the pool over entirely, building a new structure above it to house something the White House press corps had never really had before, a dedicated briefing room. The space became known as the James S. Brady Press Briefing Room, named years later in honor of Reagan's press secretary, and it remains the setting for nearly every White House press briefing broadcast to the public today. The transformation wasn't purely destructive, though it might sound that way. Rather than demolishing the pool outright, workers built a new floor directly over it, leaving the pool itself largely intact beneath the briefing room's foundation. It's still down there, an empty concrete basin sealed away beneath the very spot where press secretaries have stood for over 50 years, fielding questions from reporters. It's a peculiar bit of layered history, a president's therapeutic retreat quietly buried beneath one of the most photographed rooms in the entire complex, hidden just beneath the floorboards of modern political theater. And speaking of hidden spaces built quietly into the structure of the White House, the sealed pool beneath the briefing room isn't the only part of the building designed to stay out of sight. 38. Hidden servant staircases. Tucked between the grand staircases and formal hallways that visitors associate with the White House are a series of much narrower, far less decorative staircases, built specifically to allow household staff to move between floors without ever crossing paths with guests or residents during formal occasions. These passages date back to the earliest architectural planning of the residence, reflecting a design philosophy common to grand homes of the era, one that assumed the smooth operation of a household depended on the labor behind it remaining largely invisible. During state dinners and formal receptions, butlers, valets, and household staff would use these narrow staircases to slip between the kitchens, storage areas, and upper floors, delivering trays, retrieving items, or attending to last-minute preparations without disrupting the carefully choreographed atmosphere unfolding in the main rooms. The staircases were often steep, narrow, and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the polished wood and sweeping banisters found in the more public areas of the residence. Over the decades, as the White House underwent renovations, particularly the extensive reconstruction during Truman's presidency in the late 1940s, many of these passages were preserved, reinforced, or occasionally rerouted, but the underlying purpose remained the same, allowing the household to function quietly and efficiently behind the scenes. Even today, staff still rely on portions of this hidden network to move throughout the building without interrupting formal events or interfering with the more visible ceremonial spaces above. It's a small architectural detail that speaks to something larger about the way the White House was designed, not simply as a home or an office, but as a fully functioning household requiring an entire invisible infrastructure just to keep it running smoothly. Every state dinner captured in photographs, every formal reception remembered for its elegance, depended quietly on staff, moving unseen through these narrow, unadorned corridors just behind the walls. And speaking of details quietly working behind the scenes of formal White House functions, few things reflect the sheer scale of that hidden effort quite as literally as what ends up sitting on the table itself. 39. A rotating china collection. Since the earliest days of the Republic, each presidential administration has, in one form or another, added its own china pattern to what has become an extraordinarily vast historical collection housed within the White House. The tradition traces back to George Washington, who ordered his own set of formal china, understanding early on that the young nation's table settings would carry a certain symbolic weight, whether hosting foreign dignitaries or simply reinforcing the dignity of the still new office. Since then, nearly every administration has commissioned its own pattern, sometimes modest, sometimes remarkably elaborate, reflecting the tastes, priorities, and occasionally the budgetary constraints of the era in which it was created. Some patterns became iconic in their own right. Mary Todd Lincoln's purple bordered set, chosen amid considerable public criticism during the Civil War for its perceived extravagance, remains one of the most recognizable in the collection today. Franklin Roosevelt's china, more understated, reflected the tightened economic realities of the Great Depression, while Reagan's vivid red-bordered set became known for its bold formal presence at state dinners throughout the 1980s. Over time, these individual contributions accumulated into what is now referred to as the White House China Collection, a sprawling assortment of place settings, serving pieces, and ceremonial items spanning more than 2 centuries of presidential history. Much of it is preserved and displayed today in the China Room, established in 1917 specifically to house and showcase the growing collection for visitors touring the residence. Each piece tells its own quiet story, not just of presidential taste, but of the shifting economic and cultural pressures of its time, whether that meant restraint during wartime, elegance during periods of prosperity, or careful diplomacy reflected in patterns designed with an eye toward international guests. It's easy to overlook something as simple as a dinner plate, but within the walls of the White House, even the china carries its own quiet thread of history, passed from administration to administration, one table setting at a time. 40. The original stone color. Long before the White House became synonymous with its brilliant white exterior, the building actually began its life in a very different shade entirely, one far less pristine and considerably more subdued than the gleaming facade recognized around the world today. When construction began in 1792, builders used a porous grayish sandstone quarried from Aquia Creek in Virginia, a material chosen largely for its availability and workability rather than any grand symbolic vision of an iconic white residence. This sandstone, however, came with a significant drawback. It absorbed water easily, and in the freezing winters of the mid-Atlantic region, that moisture would expand and contract, gradually cracking and deteriorating the stone's surface over time. To protect the building from this slow but steady damage, workers began applying a lime wash mixture, a combination of lime, rice, glue, and casein, brushed directly onto the stone as a protective sealant. This early coating wasn't really paint in the way we think of it today. It was closer to a preservation treatment, something applied out of structural necessity rather than aesthetic preference. Over the following decades, as the building endured harsh winters, humid summers, and eventually the fire set by British troops in 1814, that limewash coating became something of a permanent fixture, replied again and again to protect the increasingly fragile sandstone beneath. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the maintenance approach shifted toward true lead-based paint, providing a more durable and weather-resistant finish that could withstand Washington's shifting seasons far better than the original limewash ever could. By the time this became standard practice, the building had already been informally known as the White House for generations, the name having taken root in public conversation long before it became the mansion's official title in 1901 under Theodore Roosevelt. So, in a strange twist of historical cause and effect, the very name we associate with dazzling white grandeur actually began as a practical solution to a stone that couldn't quite handle Virginia's weather on its own. What started as protective maintenance eventually became inseparable from the building's identity, a slow transformation from function to symbol that unfolded so gradually most people today assume the White House was always meant to be, well, white. And speaking of the White House adapting to circumstances well beyond its original architectural plans, few periods tested that adaptability quite like the years the nation spent tearing itself apart. 41. Civil War era use. When the Civil War began in 1861, Washington, D.C. found itself in an unusually precarious position, a southern-leaning border city suddenly transformed into the beating heart of the Union war effort, and the White House grounds themselves became swept up in that transformation far more directly than most people realize today. With thousands of Union troops flooding into the Capitol to defend it from potential Confederate advance, nearby buildings and open spaces around the White House were pressed into service for purposes far removed from their peacetime function. The East Room, typically reserved for receptions and formal gatherings, was at times used to quarter troops during the earliest, most chaotic days of the war, when Washington's defenses were still being hastily organized and no one was entirely certain the city itself could be held. As the war dragged on, nearby buildings and structures surrounding the White House complex were converted for medical purposes, treating wounded soldiers brought in from nearby engagements, since the scale of casualties quickly overwhelmed existing hospital capacity throughout the city. Even the grounds themselves saw changes, with makeshift camps and support facilities appearing at various points as the Union military organized its presence around the Capitol's most symbolically important building. President Lincoln, who occupied the White House throughout this entire period, lived and worked amid this atmosphere of constant military activity, receiving reports from the front, meeting with generals, and grappling with the emotional weight of a war that was, quite literally, unfolding just beyond his windows. It's easy, looking back today, to picture the White House as an isolated, protected space removed from the chaos of history, but during the Civil War it was very much embedded within it, a working part of the Union's wartime infrastructure rather than a distant symbol observing from a comfortable remove. Soldiers, medical staff, and government officials moved through spaces normally reserved for diplomacy and ceremony, blurring the line between residence and battlefield support in a way that would have seemed unthinkable in peacetime. It's a quieter piece of Civil War history, overshadowed by the larger battles and political drama of the era, but it speaks to just how deeply that conflict touched every corner of the Capitol, even the private and ceremonial heart of the presidency itself. And speaking of quieter details tucked within the White House's long history, one of its most curious secrets wasn't a matter of stone or soldiers at all, but something considerably more electronic. 42. Secret taping systems. When people think of secret recording devices inside the Oval Office, the conversation almost always drifts toward Richard Nixon, whose taping system famously became central to the Watergate scandal and his eventual resignation in 1974. But long before Nixon's tapes became a household topic, several other presidents had quietly installed their own recording systems, each with different motivations, and most operating entirely outside public knowledge until years later. Franklin Roosevelt was actually the first, setting up a recording system in 1940, reportedly to preserve accurate records of press conferences after concerns arose about journalists misquoting his remarks. The system was crude by later standards, but it marked the beginning of a quiet tradition that would continue on and off for decades. Truman continued limited taping practices, though evidence suggests his system saw far less use than his successors. Eisenhower installed his own system as well, largely to maintain accurate records of sensitive conversations during the tense early years of the Cold War. Kennedy expanded this practice significantly, recording numerous meetings throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, conversations that later became invaluable to historians piecing together exactly how those tense negotiations unfolded in real time. Johnson continued the practice too, taping numerous calls and meetings throughout his presidency, some of which offer surprisingly candid insight into the political maneuvering behind major civil rights legislation. By the time Nixon's system was installed, voice activated and capturing nearly everything said within the Oval Office, the practice of secretly recording presidential conversations wasn't some radical departure from precedent. It was in many ways simply the continuation of something quietly normalized across several administrations before him. What made Nixon's case different wasn't the act of recording itself, but the content of those recordings and the legal battle that followed when investigators sought access to them. After Nixon's resignation, the practice largely came to an end, at least in any comparable form, as future administrations grew understandably wary of leaving behind such a detailed, unfiltered record of private conversations. It's a strange thought, walking through the quiet historical narrative of the Oval Office, imagining just how many earlier conversations, now lost to time or still sitting in archives, were captured on tape long before anyone associated secret recordings with scandal at all. 43. FDR's private elevator. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933, he brought with him a physical reality that the White House itself had never really been designed to accommodate: the lasting effects of the polio he had contracted more than a decade earlier, which left him unable to walk without assistance for the remainder of his life. Rather than rely solely on the existing staircases and the standard elevator already present in the building, a specialized elevator was installed to help him move between floors with as much privacy and dignity as possible, a quiet architectural adjustment that reflected the very personal challenges playing out behind the public image of the presidency. Roosevelt worked hard throughout his political career to manage public perception of his condition, appearing standing with the support of leg braces and canes during speeches, and photographers largely cooperated by avoiding images that showed him in his wheelchair or being physically assisted. Behind the scenes, though, the White House itself had to adapt in very real, very practical ways, and this elevator became one of the clearest examples of that adaptation. It allowed him to move quietly between the residence and his working spaces without the elaborate coordination that stairs would have required, sparing him both the physical strain and the public visibility of being carried or supported in front of staff and visitors. It's a small mechanical detail in the grand sweep of Roosevelt's presidency, easy to overlook next to the weight of the Great Depression and the Second World War, but it speaks volumes about how much effort went into presenting an image of strength and stability during some of the most uncertain years in American history. The elevator wasn't flashy or symbolic in the way so many other White House features tend to be discussed. It was simply functional, a tool built out of necessity, quietly woven into the architecture, so that a president facing significant physical limitations could still carry out the demands of leading a nation through economic collapse and global conflict. Long after Roosevelt's presidency ended, the elevator remained part of the building's infrastructure, a subtle reminder that even the most powerful office in the country has always had to bend, at least a little, to accommodate the very human needs of the people who occupy it. And speaking of quiet spaces built for very specific purposes within the White House, one particular room downstairs has spent decades serving a far more contemplative function. 44. The White House Library, tucked away on the ground floor, in a space that feels almost deliberately calm compared to the ceremonial grandeur found elsewhere in the building, sits a library holding a carefully curated collection of American historical and literary works, gathered over time to serve both as a resource and as a quiet reflection of the nation's broader cultural identity. The room itself has a long history, having served various purposes over the decades before settling into its current identity as a library during a mid-20th century renovation, when First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy took a particular interest in shaping the historical character of the White House's interior spaces. The collection housed there wasn't assembled randomly. It reflects deliberate curation, chosen specifically to represent significant contributions to American thought, literature, and history, offering a kind of quiet cross-section of the country's intellectual and cultural development available for reference whenever needed. Unlike a grand public library meant for extensive browsing, this space functions more as a working resource, tucked quietly within a building otherwise dominated by ceremony, diplomacy, and the constant motion of executive business. It's easy to imagine the room as simply decorative, another handsomely appointed space among many within the mansion's ground floor. But it has served practical purposes as well, offering a quiet setting for meetings, interviews, and moments, requiring a slightly more contemplative atmosphere than the more formal reception rooms nearby. Over the years, various administrations have made subtle adjustments to the collection and its presentation, reflecting changing tastes and priorities while maintaining the room's core identity as a space dedicated to American letters and history. There's something quietly fitting about a house so thoroughly shaped by ceremony and public spectacle, also making room for a space built around books and quiet reflection. A small pocket of stillness within a building otherwise defined by constant activity and historical weight. It remains one of the lesser discussed rooms of the White House, overshadowed by more famous spaces like the Oval Office or the East Room, but its presence speaks to a quieter tradition, one that values reflection and reference alongside the more visible business of governing. And speaking of spaces built quietly beneath the more visible parts of the White House, few additions reflect the anxieties of their era quite as clearly as the security shelters constructed during the tense years of the Cold War. 45. A Cold War bunker upgrade. During the early 1960s, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reached levels that left much of the country quietly bracing for the possibility of nuclear conflict, the security shelters beneath the White House grounds underwent significant reinforcement, a project undertaken with the kind of quiet urgency that defined so much of Cold War-era infrastructure across Washington. These shelters had existed in earlier, more modest forms for years, originally constructed with the threats of an earlier era in mind, but by the time President Kennedy took office, the stakes had shifted dramatically, and the shelters needed to reflect a world where nuclear weapons were no longer a distant hypothetical but a very real, very immediate concern. The reinforcement work focused on strengthening the structural integrity of the underground spaces, improving their capacity to withstand blast pressure, and ensuring they could sustain essential government functions for extended periods if the unthinkable ever occurred. This period coincided with a broader nationwide push towards civil defense preparedness. As communities across the country built fallout shelters, schools practiced duck and cover drills, and families stocked emergency supplies in basements just in case. The White House shelters existed within that same anxious cultural moment, though naturally on a far more sophisticated and closely guarded scale, designed to protect the continuity of government leadership rather than simply provide temporary refuge. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 only intensified the sense that these preparations weren't merely symbolic gestures, but genuinely necessary contingencies given how close the world seemed to come to catastrophic conflict during those tense 13 days. Details about the specific engineering and capacity of these shelters have remained largely classified over the decades, a reflection of their ongoing role within national security planning rather than simply historical curiosity. What is publicly known paints a picture of quiet, methodical reinforcement, undertaken not with dramatic announcements or public reassurance campaigns, but through careful engineering work meant to ensure the presidency itself could continue functioning even under the most catastrophic circumstances imaginable. It's a sobering thought, walking through the quiet historical record of the White House, imagining these reinforced spaces sitting beneath the ceremonial rooms above, built during years when the possibility of nuclear war felt uncomfortably close, a reminder that even the most symbolically significant building in the country has always had to prepare quietly for its darkest possible chapter. 46. 28 fireplaces throughout. Long before central heating became a reliable feature of American homes, the White House relied on an extensive network of fireplaces to keep its many rooms warm through the cold Washington winters, and remarkably, a significant number of those original fireplaces remain in the building today, 28 in total scattered across the residence. Some purely decorative now, others still capable of being lit for warmth, or simply for the quiet ambiance that only real fire seems to provide. When the White House was first constructed in the late 18th century, fireplaces weren't a luxury or an aesthetic choice so much as an absolute necessity, the primary means by which the building's occupants survived the sometimes brutal winters of the region, and early staff would have spent considerable time each day simply keeping fires stocked and burning throughout the mansion's various chambers. As the building expanded and renovated over the decades, many of these fireplaces were preserved even as more modern heating systems were gradually introduced, a decision that reflected both practical redundancy and a genuine appreciation for the historical character these features brought to the rooms they occupied. Some of the most notable fireplaces can be found in rooms like the state dining room, where the mantel itself carries carved inscriptions reflecting the hopes of early presidents for the nation's future, a quiet blending of function and symbolism that runs throughout so much of the White House's design. Other fireplaces are tucked into smaller, less publicly visible rooms, remnants of an era when nearly every room needed its own independent heat source, since warmth didn't travel efficiently through a building of that size without help in every corner. During the various renovations the White House has undergone, particularly the major reconstruction during the Truman administration, when the interior was essentially rebuilt around a steel frame, many of these fireplaces were carefully preserved or reconstructed to maintain the historical integrity of the rooms they belonged to, even as the building modernized considerably behind the walls. It's a detail that tends to go unnoticed by most visitors and even by many of the staff who move through these spaces every day. But there's something quietly comforting about the fact that a building so associated with formality, power, and historical weight still holds on to something as simple and ancient as a working fireplace. The same technology humans have relied on for warmth and gathering for thousands of years. Today, these fireplaces are rarely used for their original practical purpose, since modern heating systems handle the building's temperature far more efficiently and safely, but they remain part of the architectural fabric nonetheless, occasionally lit during the winter holidays or special occasions, filling certain rooms with a flickering warmth that feels almost like a direct link back to the earliest days of the residence. It's easy to walk past a fireplace without much thought, but each one in the White House carries its own quiet history, a small architectural witness to over 2 centuries of change within the walls surrounding it. And speaking of the many pathways built to move people quietly through this historic residence, the staircases connecting its various floors carry their own layered stories as well. 8 staircases in total. Moving through the White House means navigating a surprisingly complex network of vertical connections, 8 separate staircases in total, winding through the building in ways that reflect both its practical needs and its long history of expansion and renovation over more than 2 centuries. Some of these staircases are grand and ceremonial, designed to be seen and admired, the kind that appear in official photographs and historical paintings, sweeping curves of polished wood and iron railings, meant to convey a sense of dignity befitting the nation's most recognizable residents. Others are far more modest and functional, tucked away in service corridors, originally built for staff to move quietly between floors without disrupting the more formal spaces used by the president's family and official guests. This division between public and private circulation has existed since the earliest days of the building's design, reflecting a broader historical pattern in grand residences, where those who worked within the walls were expected to remain largely unseen, moving through separate passageways entirely distinct from the more visible spaces used by the household's most prominent occupants. Over the decades, as the White House underwent various renovations, particularly the extensive reconstruction during the Truman years when the interior was gutted and rebuilt around a new structural frame, many of these staircases were reinforced or reconfigured, though care was taken to preserve their historical character wherever possible. The grand staircase, perhaps the most recognizable of the group, has served as the backdrop for countless official photographs, presidents and first ladies descending its steps for state dinners and formal receptions, a visual tradition that has become deeply embedded in the public's understanding of what the White House represents. Yet alongside these more famous staircases exist quieter passageways, narrower and less ornamented, historically used by household staff carrying meals, linens, and messages between floors without disturbing the ceremonial business unfolding elsewhere in the building. These service staircases, though far less photographed, tell an equally important story about the daily rhythm of life within the residence, a constant quiet movement of people working to keep the household functioning smoothly behind the scenes. Some staircases connect only specific sections of the building, reflecting the piecemeal way the White House has grown and adapted over time, rather than following a single unified design from its earliest construction. Walking through the building today, it's easy to imagine the layered decades of footsteps that have passed along each staircase, some belonging to presidents and world leaders, others to the household staff whose quiet labor has kept the residence running smoothly through war, peace, celebration, and crisis alike. And speaking of the quiet mechanical additions that have helped this historic building keep pace with modern life, the elevators installed over the years reflect their own layered history of accessibility and necessity. 48. 3 elevators for access. Beyond the staircases that have connected the White House's floors since its earliest construction, three elevators have been added over different periods of the building's history, each reflecting the particular needs and technological capabilities of the era in which it was installed. The earliest of these elevators arrived long after the building's original construction, a practical response to the growing recognition that stairs alone weren't always sufficient for the needs of everyone who lived and worked within the residence, particularly as the White House staff, and its daily operations grew increasingly complex over the decades. As mentioned earlier in relation to President Roosevelt's specific circumstances, additional elevator capacity was installed to accommodate physical needs that the building's original staircases simply couldn't address, a quiet but significant adaptation that allowed the presidency to continue functioning smoothly despite the personal challenges of the individual occupying the office. Beyond that specific historical adjustment, elevators within the White House have also served far more mundane, practical purposes over the years, moving food from kitchen areas to dining spaces, transporting furniture and equipment during renovations, and simply offering an alternative to the stairs for staff managing the countless daily tasks required to keep the residence running smoothly. Each of the three elevators serves a slightly different function within the building's layout, reflecting the specific needs of the areas they connect, whether that's moving official visitors between formal reception spaces, assisting household staff with the physical demands of maintaining a building of this size, or simply providing convenient access for residents of the upper floors going about their daily lives away from the public eye. The technology behind these elevators has been updated periodically over the decades, replaced or modernized as mechanical systems improved, though always installed and maintained with an eye toward preserving the historical character of the surrounding architecture, a balance between modern convenience and historical integrity that defines so much of the White House's ongoing maintenance. It's easy to overlook something as simple as an elevator button while thinking about the grand history unfolding within the walls surrounding it. But each quiet mechanical journey between floors represents a small, practical continuation of the building's core purpose, supporting the daily life and labor required to keep the presidency functioning smoothly, regardless of who occupies the office at any given time. These small technological additions, layered quietly alongside centuries-old staircases and fireplaces, reflect the broader story of the White House itself, a building constantly adapting to new needs while carrying forward the weight of its long, layered history. Whether it's a grand staircase built for ceremony, a quiet service passage built for necessity, or a simple elevator installed to accommodate changing physical needs, each element of the building's internal architecture tells its own small story, quietly woven into the larger history of the nation's most recognizable residents. 49. John Quincy Adams's Alligator. Among all the quiet, unverified stories that have attached themselves to the White House over the centuries, few are as strange or as oddly charming as the tale of John Quincy Adams and his supposed pet alligator, an animal said to have been kept, at least for a time, within one of the bathrooms of the presidential residence. According to the story, the alligator arrived as a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat and military officer who had played such a significant role in supporting the American cause during the Revolutionary War, and who remained a celebrated friend of the young nation for decades afterward. When Lafayette visited the United States in the 1820s, he was received with enormous public affection, showered with gifts and tributes wherever he traveled, and it's within this atmosphere of exchange and goodwill that the legend of the alligator is said to have taken root, a token passed along to President Adams as a peculiar exotic curiosity befitting the excitement surrounding Lafayette's visit. The story goes that Adams, rather than finding somewhere else to house the animal, kept it for a period of time in one of the White House bathrooms, allegedly delighting in showing it off to unsuspecting visitors who had no idea what awaited them behind the door. It's an image that tends to stick in the imagination, a reptile quietly occupying a tub in one of the young nation's most formal residences, a strange contrast between the seriousness of the presidency and the almost absurd domestic reality unfolding just out of public view. As charming as the story is, it's worth noting that historians have never been able to fully confirm the details, and much of what circulates today exists more in the realm of popular legend than documented fact, passed along through retellings, historical anecdotes, and the kind of oral tradition that tends to grow more colorful with each passing generation. Whether the alligator truly lived in the White House for weeks, or whether the story has simply been exaggerated or slightly reshaped over the past 2 centuries, remains uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of what keeps the tale alive. It reflects something true about the era nonetheless. A time when exotic animals were often treated as novel gifts among the elite, symbols of international friendship, curiosity, and status, long before modern conservation concerns reshaped how such animals were viewed and treated. Whatever truly happened within those walls, the story of Adams's alligator has become one of those small, memorable threads woven into the White House's much larger tapestry of history, a light-hearted footnote resting quietly among centuries of far weightier events. And speaking of the physical structure that has hosted so many strange, wonderful, and complicated stories over the years, the sheer scale of the building itself carries its own quiet astonishment. 50, hundreds of doors and windows. For all the individual stories, legends, and quiet historical details we've wandered through, it's worth stepping back for a moment to consider the sheer physical scale of the White House itself. A building reportedly containing 412 doors and 147 windows spread across its 6 sprawling levels, a number that tends to surprise people who think of the White House primarily through its familiar, relatively modest exterior facade, seen so often in photographs and news broadcasts. That exterior view, the iconic north and south porticos framed by lawns and fountains, offers only the faintest hint of the labyrinthine complexity hidden behind those white columns, a structure that expands far beyond what most visitors imagine when picturing the president's residence. 6 levels in total wind through the building, including 2 below ground level, housing everything from mechanical systems and storage to secure facilities rarely mentioned publicly, layered beneath the more familiar reception rooms and private quarters above. Each door and window within this vast structure carries its own small purpose, some leading between grand ceremonial rooms designed for state dinners and formal receptions, others tucked away in narrow service corridors once used quietly by household staff moving between floors, and still others serving the more mundane, practical needs of a building that functions as both a family home and the operational center of a nation's executive branch. The sheer number of windows, meanwhile, speaks to the building's reliance on natural light long before electricity became a dependable feature of daily life, a design necessity in the late 18th century that has simply persisted as an architectural signature ever since, softening what might otherwise feel like an imposing fortress-like structure. Maintaining all these doors and windows across 2 centuries of renovations, expansions, and structural overhauls, including the extensive rebuilding during the Truman administration, has required constant attention, careful restoration work aimed at preserving historical character while quietly modernizing the systems hidden just behind the walls. It's easy to walk past a door without a second thought, but within the White House, each one has likely witnessed its own small moment in history, a quiet conversation, a hurried decision, a private exchange between two people history may never fully record. As we come to the end of this long, quiet walk through the White House's many corners, corridors, and curiosities, it's worth simply appreciating the building for what it truly is, not just a political symbol, but a living structure, layered with centuries of small human moments, quietly holding its history within every door, every window, and every softly worn staircase. Sleep well, and thank you for wandering through these forgotten corners of the White House with me tonight.